I'm Mark Lloyd, clinical professor of communication at the Annenberg School of Communication and Journalism. I am here to present the Walter Cronkite Award for network coverage of systemic racism to PBS Frontline for Policing the Police 2020, a documentary about Newark's half-decade struggle to fix the relationship between the police department and its Black residents. Judges hailed the work of correspondent Jelani Cobb and filmmakers James Jacoby and Annenberg as thoughtful, balanced, and inspiring. What this story does beautifully is illuminate, judges said, shedding light on police reform without drama or hyperbole, using a story of abuse and intolerance to bring a sense of calm and search for solutions, not only for policing, but also for education, housing, healthcare, and other systems permeated by racial inequality. Let's have a look.
We're gonna start splitting up this side of the street, the other side of the street.
The Newark Street Team has grown to a 50-person organization.
This is our 1-800 number if you see something transpiring.
It's become an important part of the city's overall approach to use community interventions instead of police to reduce violence. In July, we met up with street team workers in the South Ward. Talk to me a little bit about what's happening here and why the street team is walking down Brookdale Street.
Yeah, so July 4th weekend, we had a double homicide on this block.
Wow.
You know, we talked directly to the family members who've been impacted. And if there is plan for retaliation, that we convince them not to retaliate. We always say that we cannot stop the first bullet, but we sure can stop the second, the third, and fourth one.
We coming to you live near Dayton with North Community Street Team.
This is one of the areas that's called our hot spot.
We just want to touch everybody. If you need any services, we here.
Find us on our Facebook, like our page.
The street team is also trained to answer distress calls. They're stationed outside of the city's schools. And they're embedded in the hospital to help victims and perpetrators of violence with social, legal, and psychological services.
We're trying to introduce more alternative ways for people to actually address their trauma. You got all of the violence that has happened over the years, multi-generational trauma. I'm like, you know, you have young guys here, man. I'm like, it was astounding, brother, that most of the people on my team had been shot. You know, male and female, and their parents were shot, and their parents' parents were shot, you know?
Accepting the award for PBS's Frontline's Policing the Police 2020 is correspondent Jelani Cobb.
Thank you to the Cronkite Awards Committee and to the Annenberg School of Communications for recognizing our film with this award. This project was conceived of and created in the midst of a pandemic that complicated every step of the creative process, and every member of our team went above and beyond because they felt that this story was important enough to warrant the risks inherent in telling it. I'd like to thank our producers, Anya Borg, James Jacoby, and Megan Robertson, our editor, Pierre Takal, Jeremy Gould, our cameraman, senior producer, Frank Kewen, and of course, Andrew Metz, Frontline's managing editor, and Rainey Aronson Rath, the executive producer of Frontline, who was involved in every aspect of this process. A special shout out goes to our associate producer, Joshua Nehemiah Bester, and the whole team at Frontline. It means a great deal for our film to be associated with the legacy of commitment and integrity that Walter Cronkite exemplified, particularly in a moment when the very ideas of facts and truths are under attack. A little more than a year ago, we, along with millions of other people in this country and around the world, became reluctant witnesses to the last moments of George Floyd, an American citizen whose life was extinguished in the most casually brutal way imaginable. Of the many divides in this nation, we were introduced to a most fundamental one, the division between those who knew we lived in a country where such a thing is possible, and those for whom this video of Mr. Floyd's death was an introduction to that fact. The shock of that moment yielded promises of change and introspection, some, but not all of them, sincere. We've seen some efforts at change, but distressingly, we've also seen recalcitrant efforts to stymie it. As we speak, we are mired in useless, bad faith debates about critical race theory and disputes about the validity of the term systemic racism. But each of our cornerstone institutions in American life, our housing sector, our employment sector, our educational and healthcare systems, yield disparate outcomes that stubbornly correlate to race. This is a fact. This is the truth. Our film explored one city and the fraught relationship of one system, policing, and the legacy of bias that it is trying to escape. We told this story because we believed Newark could serve as a microcosm of a problem that is fundamental to this society. We were not naive enough to believe that a single film could resolve this problem. But as James Baldwin observed, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. I think I can speak for our whole team when I say that if we have helped ourselves collectively face this problem, then in some measure we have achieved what we set out to do. Thank you again to the Cronkite Awards.
I had a chance to talk with Jelani Cobb about his documentary and covering systemic racism. Full conversation is online at cronkiteawards.org. Here's a clip from that.
I think that a lot of things could have happened in Minneapolis. Minneapolis had a lot of chances to get this right before May 25th of last year. And, what I mean by that is, there was, Philando Castile, who was killed, in a car after he told an officer that he was a licensed carrier of a firearm. And that happened just outside Minneapolis, in a suburb of Minneapolis. There was Justine Demond, who was killed by Muhammad Noor, a police officer in Minneapolis before that. There was the Jamar Clark incident. He was killed by a police officer, and there were disputes about whether he was handcuffed at the time or not. But it was, a huge controversy. There have been multiple cases in which the MPD had a chance to revisit and review what they were doing and to take a move in a different direction. None of that happened, and the death of George Floyd was the culmination of that. The other thing that I think is important, something that hasn't been talked about as much in that case, was the fact that Derek Chauvin was a 19-year veteran of the police department. And so when people began to kind of make the argument that he was an isolated problem, there wasn't a systemic concern, the problem is that this person could have all these kinds of traits and all these characteristics and still be in that police department for 19 years and not be rooted out. And so it does point to a kind of systemic concern there.
So one of the other interesting things that you did with the documentary was, I think it was the drive along with, I think these were like Black and Latino officers in Newark, which suggests that part of the problem that you were highlighting about police brutality was not simply the problem of white officers, that this was a problem about something else. Am I making sense? Do you know what I'm referring to?
So in Newark, what happened in 1967 when Newark had that huge uprising, as a result of a Black cab driver being beaten by white police officers. And, there was a riot that lasted 5 days in the city. It kind of marked the city's history. And one of the things that came out of the report that was issued was that the police department needed to diversify. They needed to have more Black officers on the force and more Latino officers on the force. Well, now Newark has a majority-minority police department, but they still have some of the same problems. And, that's not to say that there's not a racial implication to this. When I talked to the mayor about that, I said up front, look, you have a majority-minority police department. Can you say these problems are a matter of race? And he said, yes, because the question is not who's doing it. The question is who is on the receiving end of it.